This is Logan Blackwood, reporting for International Desk. On Tuesday, Iran's top military negotiator posted a message that should have stopped the world in its tracks. He did not send it through back channels. He did not whisper it in a closed diplomatic meeting. He posted it publicly, for every government, every intelligence agency, and every military planner on Earth to read. The message was this: we do not accept negotiations under the shadow of threat. And over the past 2 weeks, we have been preparing to reveal new cards on the battlefield. New cards on the battlefield. From Iran's lead negotiator. During an active ceasefire, with peace talks either happening or collapsing in Pakistan this week. That same day, Trump told a reporter that if there is no deal, he expects the fighting to resume immediately. That the whole country is going to get blown up, bridges, power plants, everything. That lots of bombs will start going off. Iran's Central Military Command issued a formal statement warning that if civilian targets are struck again, the next stages of offensive and retaliatory operations will be much more devastating and widespread. The ceasefire is technically still in place, but the language being exchanged between these two governments is not the language of peace. It is the language of two sides telling each other, and telling the world, that they are ready to fight. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you exactly what Iran's retaliation threat means, what new cards on the battlefield could actually look like, why U.S. military planners are now openly developing strike plans for a post-ceasefire scenario, and why a conflict that was supposed to be winding down is now, in the words of a former U.S. ambassador, at the last chance to reach an agreement before something far worse begins. Stay with me, because the window for diplomacy has never been narrower, and what happens next could change this conflict entirely. Before we get into the specifics, I want you to think about a pressure cooker. You put it on the stove, you turn up the heat. Inside, pressure builds. You add a release valve, the ceasefire, and for a moment, the pressure stops rising. But you don't turn off the heat. You keep the blockade. You keep the military assets in position. You keep threatening to blow up the infrastructure. And Iran keeps seizing ships, mining the waterway, and announcing new battlefield preparations. The valve is still there, but the heat is still on, and the pressure is still rising. The Strait of Hormuz is that pressure cooker. 20% of the world's oil moves through it. The global economy depends on it staying open. And right now, two governments are standing on opposite sides of it, each turning up the heat, while the world holds its breath, hoping the valve holds. Here is the full picture of where this stands right now. And it is more dangerous than most headlines are capturing. The ceasefire was agreed on April 7th. It was always fragile. Within days, both sides were accusing the other of violations. Iran kept restricting shipping through Hormuz. The U.S. imposed a naval blockade on April 13th, during the ceasefire, which Iran called a direct violation of its terms. The U.S. seized an Iranian cargo ship on April 19th. Iran responded by seizing 2 container ships. Trump threatened to knock out every single power plant and every single bridge in Iran. Iran's military command warned of much more devastating retaliation. Trump then extended the ceasefire, but kept the blockade in place. Iran said it would not negotiate under those conditions. And on Tuesday, Iran's top negotiator went public with the most alarming statement of this entire conflict: that Iran has spent the past 2 weeks preparing new battlefield options. 2 weeks. Since the ceasefire began, Iran has been preparing, not negotiating, not de-escalating, not disarming, preparing. But here's where it gets worse. CNN reported this week that U.S. military officials are now actively developing new strike plans specifically targeting Iran's capabilities in and around the Strait of Hormuz. Fast attack boats, mine-laying vessels, coastal missile systems, and other asymmetric assets. The options under consideration include dynamic targeting, real-time strikes against Iranian military activity as it happens. And sources told CNN that additional strikes would likely also target Iran's remaining missile launchers and drone production facilities, assets that U.S. intelligence assessed had survived the initial February bombing campaign. Here is the detail that matters most. U.S. intelligence estimated that roughly half of Iran's missile launchers and thousands of one-way attack drones survived the initial U.S.-Israeli strikes. During the ceasefire, Iran has been moving those assets. Defense Secretary Hegseth acknowledged publicly that Iran has relocated some of its remaining military capabilities to new positions during the truce, and threatened to hit those targets if Iran refuses a deal. In other words, both sides used the ceasefire to prepare for the next round of fighting, not to make peace, to prepare for war. Let's go through the receipts. Receipt number 1. Iran's retaliation warnings, and what they actually signal. The statement from Iran's parliamentary speaker and lead negotiator, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, is the most significant public signal Iran has sent since the ceasefire began. He is not a fringe voice. He led Iran's delegation in the first round of peace talks in Islamabad. He is the man who sat across the table from J.D. Vance for 21 hours. When he says Iran has been preparing new cards on the battlefield, publicly, on a verified social media account, that is the Iranian government telling the world it has military options it has not yet used. Iran's Central Military Command reinforced that message. A spokesman for Khatam al-Anbiya, Iran's Joint Military Command headquarters, issued a formal statement warning that if attacks on civilian targets are repeated, the next stages of offensive and retaliatory operations will be much more devastating and widespread. Iran's ambassador to Pakistan added a literary flourish, quoting the opening line of Pride and Prejudice, adapted, to say that Iran will not negotiate under threat and force. That is a message calibrated not just for Pakistan, but for Washington, Beijing, Moscow, and the entire international community. Iran is publicly telling every government watching, we are not surrendering, we are preparing. And there is an additional layer here that most coverage is not addressing. The Joint Chiefs of Staff warned Trump before the February 28th strikes that an attack on Iran would likely prompt it to close the Strait of Hormuz. That warning was not heeded. The Trump administration, according to CNN sources, underestimated Iran's willingness to shut the strait. Failing to prevent that closure during the initial days of the war has ultimately led to the current standoff. And the same planning failure, underestimating Iranian resolve, risks being repeated if the ceasefire collapses. Receipt number 2, the U.S. military's position and why its options are more constrained than Trump's rhetoric suggests. Trump's threats have been consistent and escalating. He has threatened to destroy Iran's power plants, to blow up its bridges, to bomb it back to the Stone Age. He told reporters that if there's no deal, he would certainly expect the fighting to resume. The rhetoric is maximalist, but the military reality, according to sources familiar with U.S. planning, is considerably more complicated. Multiple senior sources told CNN that military strikes around the Strait of Hormuz, on their own, are unlikely to immediately reopen the waterway. One source with knowledge of military planning said the calculation comes down to a single question. Unless you can prove with certainty that 100% of Iran's military capability is destroyed, it will come down to how much risk Trump is willing to accept, and whether he is prepared to start pushing ships through the strait under fire. The U.S. currently has 3 aircraft carrier strike groups in or approaching the Middle East. The USS Abraham Lincoln is in the Gulf of Oman. The USS Gerald Ford is in the northern Red Sea, deployed for roughly 300 days, one of the longest carrier deployments in U.S. naval history. The USS George H.W. Bush is transiting north from near Madagascar, having taken a longer route around Africa specifically to avoid the Houthi-threatened Bab al-Mandab Strait. When all 3 are in position, which is expected imminently, the United States will have the largest carrier presence in this region since the Gulf War. That is not a defensive posture. That is a posture for major offensive operations. And this is where everything changes. According to the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, the U.S. blockade is costing Iran $400 to $500 million per day in lost revenue. More critically, if the blockade holds through April 26th, the overflow of oil at Iranian production facilities, wells that have nowhere to send their product because the export routes are cut, risks permanent damage to the oil fields themselves. Not temporary damage, permanent geological damage to Iran's primary source of national income. That is an existential economic threat with a specific countdown. April 26th, 2 days from now. This means Iran is not just facing a diplomatic deadline, it is facing an economic and geological deadline. And it is facing it while publicly announcing that it has new battlefield options it has not yet revealed. Receipt number 3, the collapse of shipping in Hormuz and what the markets are already pricing in. Before this war began, more than 100 vessels crossed the Strait of Hormuz every single day. According to data from Lloyd's List and Kepler, that number has dropped to a fraction of its former level. On certain days in recent weeks, 0 tankers crossed. 0. The world's most critical energy choke point completely stopped. 230 fully loaded oil tankers remain stranded inside the Persian Gulf. They cannot leave through Hormuz because of the dual blockade. The oil they carry is oil that refineries in Asia and Europe need. Every additional day those ships sit idle, downstream supply tightens and prices rise further. Brent crude surged 7% in a single day last weekend when Iran reimposed restrictions. Wall Street pulled back from record highs. Oil has now risen more than 55% since this war began. U.S. gas prices are above $4 a gallon. Europe has spent an additional $28 billion on energy imports without receiving, in its own words, a single extra molecule of energy. What most people are missing is this. Even if a deal is reached in Pakistan this week, even if the ceasefire is formalized, the blockade is lifted, and Iran reopens the strait, the economic damage does not immediately reverse. Rystad Energy estimates it will take until July for oil flows to reach 90% of pre-war levels. The IEA projects global crude refinery runs will decline by 1 million barrels per day for the entire year of 2026, regardless of when the strait reopens. The shipping companies that suspended operations will take at least 2 months to resume. The refineries damaged in the initial strikes will take months or years to repair. This is a supply shock whose economic consequences have already been locked in, even in the optimistic scenario. In the worst-case scenario, a ceasefire collapse, resumed bombing, Iranian retaliation against Gulf energy infrastructure, and a prolonged second phase of active combat, the IMF's severe scenario applies. Global growth falls to 2%, global inflation exceeds 6%, and financial markets enter sustained crisis mode. Mark Sievers, a former U.S. ambassador to Oman, said it plainly on CNBC this week. This is the last chance to achieve an agreement before the ceasefire expires. Last chance. From someone who spent years as America's senior diplomat in this region, that framing, last chance, is not hyperbole. It is an assessment of what the decision tree looks like if diplomacy fails. Resumed bombing, Iranian retaliation, strikes on Gulf energy infrastructure, possible involvement of Houthi forces. A conflict that has, so far, killed nearly 3,400 people in Iran, more than 2,200 in Lebanon, and injured over 370 American service members, potentially entering a second, more destructive phase. If this is connecting dots you haven't seen anywhere else, subscribe to International Desk right now. Hit the bell, because the next 72 hours may be the most consequential of this entire conflict, and you need to be here when the next development breaks. Here is where we stand. Iran's top military negotiator has publicly announced that Iran has new battlefield options it has not yet used. Iran's Central Military Command has warned of much more devastating retaliation if civilian infrastructure is targeted. The U.S. military is actively developing strike plans for a post-ceasefire scenario targeting Iran's Strait of Hormuz capabilities. 3 U.S. carrier strike groups are converging on the region. The blockade is costing Iran $500 million a day and risks permanent damage to Iranian oil fields within 48 hours. 0 tankers crossed Hormuz on Sunday. Oil is above $90 a barrel, and the ceasefire, now extended, hangs on whether Iran sends a delegation to Pakistan and whether that delegation can agree to something before the last window closes. 2 governments, 1 waterway, both preparing for the possibility of renewed combat, both telling each other and telling the world that they are ready. I'm Logan Blackwood. This has been International Desk, and this might only be the beginning.